Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy. Thank you for joining us for Houston React Developers Group. I will be the facilitator for the event tonight. We also have Nick. He will be managing all incoming comments. And Fabian is also one of our organizers. Tonight's topic is getting acquainted with Defer and Stream with Eve. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, I would like to let everyone know that we do have a link. We're going to drop it in the chat. Anybody who is interested in a certain topic, or if you're even interested in presenting yourself, please let us know and fill out that survey. Other than that, I think I will go ahead and mute myself and take me off the screen and let Eve take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tracy and Fabian and Nick, for having me here. Great to see everyone. I don't see anyone, but great to be in great company this evening to talk a little bit more about the future of GraphQL data. So my name is Eve Porcello. You can find me online at Eve Porcello at all the places where you find people online. You can always send me an email to eve@moonhighway.com if there's ever anything I can help you with. I am coming to you live here from Tahoe City, California, where I work at Moon Highway. Moon Highway is a JavaScript training company. We teach React and GraphQL and Node.js and plain old JavaScript. And we also teach courses on LinkedIn Learning and Egghead.io and have written a couple of books about React and GraphQL. I've actually written a couple of books about React, and that's a half joke because I had to rewrite this book twice because React changes a lot over time. So this is the most up-to-date version. Okay. So today I want to start us out with a very philosophical question. And this philosophical question is all about how do we get things done? So when I think about how I get things done, I think a
Question,
lot.
Eve.
Yeah, go ahead.
Eve, are you sharing your screen, by the way?
No, I'm totally not. This is literally my
Okay.
job to share my screen, and I'm not doing it. So can
Oh,
you
you're
see
fine.
that
I'm
now?
glad we can. Yep.
Awesome.
Happy New Year's. Or there.
Sweet.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Go
Thank
ahead.
you. Awesome. That's, well, we're 2 minutes in and we figured that out. So all good. So let's think a little bit about how we get things done. So I was born January 2nd. It's right after the new year. So I'm very oriented toward I'm very oriented toward resolutions and things like this. And every time it is my birthday, I go really overboard on resolutions. So I think, okay, I'm going to exercise every morning at 5:30. I'm going to cook vegan meals every night. I'm going to meditate 3 times a day. And of course, we'll do better business this year too. And finally, I'll call my worst relatives once a week, of course. I can't forget about that. And then because I've overserved myself with resolutions, by January 3rd, I'm overserving myself with food that isn't fitting into my goals. It's all too much. So, speaking of all too much, this makes me think a little bit about GraphQL. With GraphQL, typically we think about sending a request for some data to a GraphQL API that sits in front of all of our various data sources. Then those data sources are collected and returned in a single response. Now, this is typically how that architecture looks, but we also in GraphQL, you may have heard about federation, a federated architecture where we can actually create different GraphQL microservices that sit in front of all of these various data sources. So each team can manage their own microservice, and then all of the data can still be accessed on the gateway level. So the question that we started out with was, how do we actually get things done? And with GraphQL, the way that we get things done with a query is we're going to send a query to a GraphQL endpoint. So let's say we wanted some information about a cat, for example. We could grab their name, location, their mood, and all of this would be sent to that single endpoint. Once we send the query, we'll get back a blob of JSON data. Let's think about how a mutation gets things done. So a query is how we get data with GraphQL. A mutation is how we change data with GraphQL. So we can send a mutation, let's call it set lift status, and this is going to basically return little bits of data to us after some data has been changed. And then finally, we have subscriptions, which get things done over WebSockets. So our subscription is going to change the lift status. We're going to listen for these events that are going to change the lift status. And then all of that will be passed back to our clients as needed. So these are the three types of operations that exist in the GraphQL spec. We have queries, we have mutations, and we have subscriptions. So we want to think about a query as being like a read-only fetch. We'll think of a mutation as being a write operation followed by a fetch. And then a subscription is one of those long-lived requests where we're just kind of listening. I kind of think of it like instead of a text message where you get a request and a response, it's more like a phone call where you're just hanging out there waiting for the latest data. So all of this is outlined for us in that GraphQL spec, and this is what we've had access to for the years that GraphQL has been around. So let's say we send a query. We're sending a pretty meaty query here where we have all of these different fields, many of which are nested. And the way that a typical GraphQL request works is that we're thinking about everything as a single request and a single response. So if I ask for this many fields, it's going to take quite a bit of time to get all of this data back. So this is sort of looking like my resolutions. We're saying, let's do all of this instead of breaking down all of the common tasks that I want to do into these little chunks. So this is, and there's a lot of those chunks. So this is what we're thinking about our query like. So what if there was a way to take this query and sort of prioritize the fields that were most important? We could think of these as being like those above the fold query fields or whatever are the most important ones. And then we can wait for later fields to be displayed later. So we're thinking about our query as being broken up into a couple different chunks. So this is where defer and stream come into play. So defer and stream are two new directives that are coming soon to the GraphQL spec. So if you're not familiar with the GraphQL spec, it's this document that describes everything that is part of GraphQL. And defer and stream they're coming in hot. They're going to be coming to the spec relatively soon. But what's interesting about this is that we can start to think about this stuff now, and this is actually something that people have been thinking about for quite a while. So this is actually a graphic that used to be on the Apollo website. It's on a blog right now, but this was like back in 2016. Lee Byron, one of the creators of GraphQL, actually talked about defer and stream at a conference in 2016 also. And what's interesting about this is that this is kind of what the goal of GraphQL has always been. Let's go through this though. On the left-hand side of the screen, when we don't have a defer directive, we have to wait for all of the data to display. Now, on the right-hand side, when we use the defer directive, a couple cool things are going on. Number one, we load the most important content first. We have your daily news, then the headlines will load. And then if you notice the little loading spinner, we have these two bullet points that are loading last. And then everything at the top loads first. And then we also have these other pieces that are loading in the background. So we're waiting on the data to be available until we display it. So this is what the defer directive looks like. If we look at our example query from before, we prioritize the fields that we need first, like name, location, birth location, and weight. And then any other fields that we want to defer are placed into a fragment. So think of a GraphQL fragment as being a wrapper around a bunch of fields that we want to inject into the query at a specific time. And a defer directive is always used on a fragment. And again, we're just saying load these first, and then we'll be fine. You can load the data in the background and it'll show up eventually. The other directive that we have access to in experimental builds and eventually in the actual GraphQL spec is going to be the stream directive. So let's think through what the stream directive helps us with. We're back to our cat query. This time we're trying to display the friends of our cat. So friends of our cat, each one of these friends will have a name. So if Biscuit has a few different friends, this is not that big of a deal. It's going to load relatively quickly. But as he starts to accumulate more and more friends, it's going to be trickier to load all this data. Now, what we can use the stream directive for is for any field that returns a list, like friends. This is returning a list of objects. We're going to be able to add the @stream directive alongside an initial count. So the initial count is going to say, hey, let's load the first 3, and then we'll load subsequent items in the list after that. So the stream directive is super powerful on its own, but we also can combine its powers with the defer directive. And you probably might have been thinking about this already. This is definitely possible. We have the stream directive saying, hey, let's load the first 3 objects from this list. Then we'll load the name field, which is the important field. And then any extra cat details can be deferred until they're available. So this is an example of using these in combo. Couple things to know before I show you a quick demo of this. All of these kind of emerging tools can be explored in a couple different places. The first of which, and I'll drop this in our chat. I should have asked if this was an okay place to drop that. I think someone will help me with this. So I'm just sending along a link to this, which is the GraphQL Bleeding Edge Playground. This will allow you to experiment with the let's move that over a little bit. This will allow you to experiment with the latest features of GraphQL, things like defer and stream, as well as some of the input objects and other things that are being discussed by the spec committee. Another nice resource to know about when we're trying to load this data, there's the defer and stream RFC. Oh, maybe that has been moved on to elsewhere, but that's okay. And also spec edits for defer and stream can be found here. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the GraphQL spec, it's pretty cool. The spec is maintained now not by a single company, but instead by the GraphQL.org Foundation. So that foundation, it's a bunch of companies and stakeholders who are interested in the future of GraphQL. They get together once in a while to decide what should be in the spec moving forward. And then the changes that are made to GraphQL, for the most part, are pretty additive. We're not really taking things away from GraphQL, that's a good thing. So if you want to check that out, you can. If you want to get yourself or your company involved in the GraphQL Foundation, you can get involved in that. And there's a lot of cool new things that are coming. Okay. So let's go ahead and I'll show you those other links in a second. Let's go ahead and check out a quick demo of this. So I need to run this real quick. So the first thing I'm going to do is run our server. This is going to run our server on localhost 4000. Then I'm going to run our client, which will take care of spinning up our graphical interface. And that's going to pop up on this side screen here. Give me 1 second. It's thinking about it, but it's going to happen. It's already happening on the side screen, I promise. So let's take a look at what's going on here. The place where the defer and stream stuff really starts to become important. And let me move this over a little bit. I think that's getting a little cut off. There we go. So the important part about this graphical interface to know. GraphQL only has a single endpoint, which is up here in our search bar. Graphical is this in-browser tool that we can use to send queries to a GraphQL API. Now, something that is important to note too is that all of the different queries, and in this case, there's no mutations, but all the different queries are listed here in this schema documentation, which is pretty awesome. So what I want to do first is let's write our first query. So this is going to be a test of a little bit of data. So check this out. I'm going to ask for the name from this field, and then this will show us the response, which looks exactly like the query itself. Now, the next thing I want to do is let's look for some exciting data. So I'm asking for this field called exciting data from this query. And when I click play, we have the dreaded loading spinner. We're waiting on this data to be returned. And then once it comes back, it says that it's worth the wait, but that's sort of debatable. We would have probably liked to see something appearing here, and we didn't. So what can I do to adjust this query to use defer and stream? Well, first things first, I need to create what's called a fragment. A fragment is going to be named whatever you want to name it. So we'll define that on a particular type. And then what we want to defer is actually this field called exciting data. And instead of putting this here in the query itself, we're going to use the spread syntax ... later fields. And then we'll use the @defer directive right after that. So again, defer is always used on fragments, and fragments are just a collection of fields that we can inject into a query. And you can start to think, particularly from a React perspective, like this would lend itself really nicely to a user interface, right? Where maybe we have a field for a particular UI component. I shouldn't be talking while I'm running that. I should be explaining it. You have a field for a particular UI component, and then from there, you can load extra data a little bit later. Okay, so let's try the query again. I'm going to send it. Check it out. We first of all have this property called hasNext. And hasNext, when I first send the query, is set to true, letting me know that, hey, there's some more data coming, so we can parse that if we need it. Then once the data is ready, once our exciting data has been returned, we will see that in the response. So we're breaking down our query into a few different queries. We're saying load these first, and if it has next, just wait it out. And then the data will come back in the other object. So this is what that defer directive is for. It's super useful in all sorts of situations, but it's particularly useful for kind of waiting on extra fields that may not be as important. Okay, so let's show a quick demo of the stream. So I'm going to get rid of our query and our fragment. I'm going to replace it with something called stream test. Now remember, the @stream directive is going to be used on lists. So we have inside of our documentation panel all of the things we need. Stream test is showing us that it returns a list of strings every time I send that query. So if I just click play, again, we're going to wait on all of that data to come back. It's going to come back as an array. But once we add on this stream directive, and we'll say initial count, it's asking me to put that in, which I promise. I'll say initial count is 1. So I want to receive these list items one at a time. Now when I click play, check it out. We have hasNext is true. And then by the time we're out of that data, hasNext has been set to false. So we're thinking about a list of strings in this case, but you can extrapolate that further to think about how this might be useful for objects and things like this. Everything on the internet is just a list, right? We got Tweets, that's a list of objects. And so if we wanted to load the first few, we could. If we wanted to wait on later ones, we could do that also. So this is our look at defer and stream. And you may be thinking, hey, Eve, what about pagination? How does this relate to pagination? So pagination is a little bit different. And I want to show you this as it relates to the GitHub API. I'm going to open that up here in the browser. So if you haven't taken a look at the GitHub API, particularly if you're exploring GraphQL as an option, this is definitely something to check out. I'll share the link, but you can also just go to the GraphQL API Explorer. So this is going to ask you to sign in with GitHub. And GitHub was kind of one of the first companies to make a really big bet on GraphQL. They decided this is going to be a thing. Let's make our public API a GraphQL API. And so the benefit for all of us is that we can use it to learn a little bit more about how a large organization runs their API. So let's check out the documentation real quick. We're going to look at the query. And if I scroll down a little bit, there should be a section on we'll just grab a user actually. So the user has a bunch of different repositories that they have at their disposal. So we can search ourselves. That's you. You are the viewer. Or you could say user and you could say login. I'm going to look for the user Moon Highway. And this should return that. Oh man. Login, Moon Highway. How about, there we go. So from here, what I want to do is I can hit Control Space to surface a list of all of the different items that are searchable in this query. But what I'm really curious about, I was hoping to scroll down to all of them, is this repositories list. So if we look at repositories, there is an option for pagination. So pagination just meaning how do we take a bunch of repos that I've created over time. This is the graveyard of repos that I have in my GitHub account. And just grab maybe like the first 5. What's really cool about this is it's going to allow for us to select just those items. So in this case, we will say node. This is using an interesting thing called the relay spec to define this data relationship here. So let's go ahead and select name. I should be able to send this query, and we're going to get back the kind of first 5 repos that I ever created. Kind of fun. So my point here, I do have one, is that defer and stream are a little bit different from pagination. Instead of just creating kind of a paged look at data, which we've done here, where we grab the first 5, this is giving us a whole interface for streaming data directly to the client. So it's kind of re-envisioning, reimagining how our data will be presented. And this aligns really closely with some of the new developments that are coming out in general, like server components and some other things. So taking our data, taking that one New Year's resolution and breaking it down into more digestible chunks is going to be a great way of just making the user experience much better. The perceived performance will be higher, and your websites will look quite a bit better. So, do I have my slides? I sure do. We talked a little bit about the proposed edits to the spec and how those are coming. But if you'd like to try this out, I already shared with you the GraphQL bleeding edge playground, but there's also, if you look at Express GraphQL, there is a branch here called Defer and Stream. Express GraphQL is just a Node.js implementation of a GraphQL server that you can take a look at. And then let's get our toolbar back so I can go back to GraphQL.js. So this is another one of these. It's a node implementation. So you can kind of see how the approach works here. And basically all of the code that is underlying this, what we're doing here is I've just used a couple of set timeouts to make this data move a little more slowly, but all of our resolver functions, we can use async await for them in order to create this experience of waiting on some data until it's ready. So think of our functions that return data as always being asynchronous. We may have to wait for that data to be returned. And then if we use this in combination with defer and stream, we can make our user experiences a whole lot better. Okay. So I want to thank you all so much for listening to my presentation today. I am more than happy to answer any questions though. So I will open it up to that.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you so much. Nick or Fabian, whoever is controlling the chat, do we have any questions that have come in, or do you guys have questions yourself?
So I have a question. I've listened to questions throughout the presentation. So the first one, which is the most recent one, I'm curious about stream.
Yeah.
So in that case, you did the repository. If you were to stream that repository list, and maybe I'm not, like, this is completely new to me, so I may not be fully grasping, the use cases here. But in the case that you had 1 million repositories, would it stream like those million items over the course of, like, let's say, 30 seconds or a minute? Or is there like concerns where it's like, where as a developer, I need to be thinking about, okay, I have to stream up into a limit, because if I just let the stream happen, it's going to return everything that's in my database. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And that could be super scary, right? If we were doing that. But yeah, I think for a traditional use case for a stream, we would probably use it in combination with the pagination that I just showed you before. So maybe we stream the first 20 article headings for a page. That would be a manageable number, but maybe we would want to break that down, decompose that a little more, so that maybe the first 5 come in, and then the next 5, and then the next 5, and the next 5. From there, instead of assuming that our stream will just load everything 5 at a time until till the end of time, we can add pagination back in combo with that. So our query would look a little bit different, where we might have a stream here, but then we might also pass in a, and this would probably be on this, we would pass in like one of those first 5 or whatever. And then based on user input, or based on like a click of a next button, or based on a scroll, we can load the subsequent articles when it's appropriate. So it's kind of not replacing pagination, but it's using it all together.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, this is completely new, so I'm very interested to learn more about it. The other question that I had was around deferred. So maybe you can go back to one of those, like the first few slides that you had around the cat.
Totally. Let's get that cat back in here. Cool. Sweet.
Yeah. So okay. In the case that this is kind of, it's hard to word. I'm trying to remember what, I don't want to use like the proper. All right, I'm just gonna, I guess, come on and say it. So let's say we're loading this cat named Biscuit. Like, we're fetching Biscuit from the API.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that whenever I hit the API, that it's going to hit the database, and it's going to find the cat named Biscuit, and then return it all, and then return that Biscuit cat, the cat named Biscuit. And so I know this is obviously just this is just an example here, but in the case where those, I guess you would say, like, prioritized properties share the same model as the deferred properties, would they essentially all be returned at the same time since they both come from this, the same model in the database, or is there something that maybe I'm missing? I know obviously this is a small example, but did that make sense?
Yeah, totally. So with GraphQL in general, we want to think about it as being this layer that sits on top of any sort of data source. So that's sometimes kind of maddening for us to work with because we can actually use it to wrap databases, we can use it to wrap REST APIs. And so we want to think about, instead of like we will still use those database models to be fetching data, but we want to think about each one of these fields as kind of being backed by a function. So the way that we would connect to a database is we would use a function to actually call data from wherever it is. I'm going to show a quick example of how those resolvers look. See how fast I am at getting this up. So for example, this is an API that I used for a project that uses Mongo. You can think about your favorite database being used for this. And the way that this connects with the database is we have collections for pets, customers, and checkouts. So all of these are basically making that connection to the database. And then from there, our resolver functions are going to go to the database, and using functions that we know from Mongo, we're going to return the appropriate data. So this is how this works for this is how this would work for this example as well. Let's say we had a database of cats and we're thinking, all right, let's call, what's a good example? Let's call pets.find.toArray, and that's going to go get everything from that source. So that wouldn't be that beneficial, right? Because our weight field, our GPA field, the fields that we want to defer, we still have to wait for those in the database call in order to get those back. So what we would probably do is we would probably break that down into two separate database calls to get the appropriate data. And what's also nice about GraphQL that we should not forget, is that we can rely on caching on the front end to cache the results of this request. So ideally, once we hit the database once, we won't be asking for that data again and again. Instead, we'll just be pulling that from the cache. So it's kind of two parts where it's always like we're breaking down our projects into smaller and smaller bits just in order to make things as efficient as possible. But you very well might have to break down that database call into a couple of different calls just to read the right data from the right place. I also see people who will build some sort of additional layer in between GraphQL and the database, or use a tool like Prisma or something else, which might make these calls a little bit more efficient too. So this is what that looks like I should have put this slide up before. This is what this looks like with the fragment. So deferring these fields we would have to think about on the back end how to make that as efficient as possible. I hope that helps a little bit, hopefully.
No, absolutely, yes. I actually don't have much experience with fragments. Can you do defer with multiple fragments within the same query?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So the only real rule with fragments is that you need to create them on a specific type. So let's say we had a cat type and a dog type. You would need to create different fragments for those two things. But yeah, you could for sure break down maybe our extraneous cat details, maybe grab the first three of those and defer those, and then add another defer for a different fragment. So yeah, totally.
Awesome. Thank you. Those were all my questions. Appreciate it, Eve.
Of course, yeah.
Anything in the chat, Nick? right, I'm going to assume that is a no. If we don't have any further questions, Eve, thank you so much for presenting tonight. We appreciate it. It was amazing. We definitely want to be able to share all the links that you shared with us and anything else. The video itself will be available after it's done processing. We'll get that up on our channel, and we will also include any of the links that you shared with us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. That's great.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. All right. I guess with that, we will go ahead and disconnect.
All right. Thanks, everybody.